So I'd like to begin with a comparison of two different approaches to summarization, what can be passed off, at least, under the term summarization. The first is what is arguably more traditional document summarization, where we have a text of some length, and knowing roughly what the text is about. This particular text here is about a criminal trial that is about to take place. We know that there are certain agents and roles that we need to know about in order to properly understand the importance of this text. So for criminal trials, that might include who the defendants are, also the charges that the defendants are facing, why they have been charged with that crime, the investigator who laid the charges, the sentence that they potentially face if convicted, and the broader consequences to society. And so if we can manage to find the appropriate filler for each of those roles, what we've essentially done is solved a kind of information extraction task. And summarization consists in solving that task, plus doing some kind of generation in order to put that information back into natural language. And that's what makes it a summary as opposed to an IE problem. But there's this other trend of work out there now called text-to-text generation sometimes, in which we are summarizing but on a much smaller scale, or at least on a more local scale. So this would include Knight and Marcu's now very well-known work on sentence compression, where we take a single sentence and make it smaller, preserving the most important content of that sentence. It also includes sentence fusion, where we take a couple of sentences that are very close in meaning and then combine them into a single sentence that preserves sort of the greatest hits of both of those in a single syntactic context. And so what I'm going to present here is a generalization of sentence fusion called sentence enhancement, where, like traditional fusion, we seek to align similar core sentences and combine their meanings. But that's not all. In addition to that, we want to enhance it with other sentences that are not part of the core set and yet come from the same document, or at least from the same domain. And so in this case, we have two sentences that are about recall of meat products at a rendering plant, as well as another sentence that tells us something about outbreaks of foodborne illness. And so we can actually incorporate that very useful attribution of cause into the otherwise fused sentence that results from the original core sentences. So there have been some approaches that are related to this. Notably, Elsner and Santhanam have actually proposed a method to fuse together disparate sentences, but there they were expecting manual identification that these sentences deserve to be fused by a team of editors. And our method is intended to be unsupervised, so that the onus is on us to go out into the domain or into the source text and find those related sentences to borrow content from. There was also kind of an interesting paper by Wan and some of his colleagues in Australia that tried to identify seed words in a single original sentence and then sort of unfold that into a grammatical utterance using auxiliary sentences based on word co-occurrence counts. Now, why are we bothering with sentence enhancement? The reason is that there's still a sizable gap between what I've called here text-to-text generation and the broader aspirations of concept-to-text generation as we normally think of the generation problem. They differ both in locality of context. Text-to-text generation is naturally very local, and they also differ in the amount of inference that they conduct. Normally, when I say the word inference, it's with a smile on my face and a lot of enthusiasm about the prospects for the future. But I have to acknowledge that deep semantic analysis is actually very difficult to undertake. And one of the reasons that sentence fusion, I think, is so successful is that it doesn't require that deep semantic analysis. And so we're actually not really going in the direction of deep semantic analysis here, but instead asking ourselves whether it's possible to do more with equally little. In other words, just how far can we get without taking on all of the trappings of deep semantic analysis? The motivation for this stems from some work that Jackie and I did for an earlier publication, in which we analyzed some of the characteristic differences between human-generated summaries and machine-generated summaries. And this was on the TAC dataset, TAC 2010. One of the principal differences is something called case frame density. You can think of a case frame as being roughly like a predicate relation pair. So a head in a dependency tree together with the label on an edge that emanates from it. If you look at the automated summaries that are generated in part of the TAC 2010 conference, those are shown here in blue. You can see that they greatly exceed, in general, the case frame density of the orange summaries that were generated by humans. And this is particularly interesting because in TAC 2010 and elsewhere, we've been told that one of the measures of success in summarization is the degree of centrality. You have to stay on topic. And what this graph basically says is that we have reached the bottom of the barrel for centrality. In fact, we greatly exceed the performance of humans in making central summaries. It is worth noting, however, that among the top 10 systems from the TAC 2010 conference, there's a little cluster here that did, in fact, seem to behave more like human-generated summaries. So, where do these semantic predicates come from in human-written summaries? So, as you might have expected, a lot of them come from the source text that you're summarizing, about 77% of them. But interestingly enough, another 21% can be found in in-domain articles on the same topic. So this is not the text being summarized, but it's in texts that are like the text being summarized in terms of their topic. So if we could somehow grab these, that would give us access to 98% of the predicates that humans are using. That would be a good thing. And that's as opposed to the extra 14% that we would only be adding if we just threw in a bunch of articles on various topics that were otherwise unrelated. So here we threw in the other TAC 2010 categories. There were about 7 of them. Conversely, looking at the source external sentences, we can see that 51% of them use source internal predicates, which is to say that there's actually a greater than baseline chance, looking at a sentence that doesn't come from the source, that you will find a predicate that in principle has something to do with the source. Those are pretty good odds. So what these statistics tell us, together with the work on case frame densities, is that better summarization will take place by broadening our horizons, not by just going for more centrality. And what are humans doing when they reach outside for more predicates, outside the source text? Well, the statistics that we've computed, and this is now referring to the paper I'm presenting here, show that when they use source external predicates, they are generally using predicates that are on average less frequent and that have a smaller argument entropy, which is to say that semantically they take fewer kinds of arguments. And so in contrast to a lot of claims in summarization that humans simply spruce up their summaries with new words to keep things from getting boring, or that they're borrowing new predicates because they feel guilty about copying text directly out of the original source, in fact, this shows that they are shopping for the right word, words that are lower in frequency and narrower in scope. So these are good words to be finding for us. So sentence enhancement is really just a kind of, I would say, first step towards that, where we're actually clinging to the text-to-text generation mast in order to keep this tractable and just focusing on getting that first 77%. So the procedure for sentence enhancement is to create a sentence graph from the core sentences that are to be fused, and this is very much how sentence fusion works as well. And then to expand that sentence graph, now departing from sentence fusion, with source internal non-core sentences. So we're looking within the source text for predicates that might embellish on the content that is expressed in the core. Then we extract a tree from that graph now, which probably will not be a tree by itself, and then linearize that tree into the output sentence. So to begin with, sentence graph creation, proceeding very much as Filipova and Struba did in their 2008 paper on this work, aligns nodes simply with identical lemata and parts of speech. And then sentence graph expansion adds extra nodes to that tree by finding predicates such as this orange node W here that can be merged. And there's an easy way to do this expansion and a hard way. I'll come back to the hard way in a moment. The easy way is just to use the same lemata and part of speech tags that you would have to create the original sentence graph in the first place. From that, we identify a particular subtree within this more complex graph, and we do that using an ILP optimization that's looking for informativeness, grammaticality, and also a degree of non-redundancy. And the ILP encoding that we use has the objective function that you see here, this kind of funny max that is occurring inside the sum, which is a little unusual, guarantees us that we're going to use each word at most once for its contribution, and that's something to avoid redundancy in particular. What it contributes then, it corresponds to a head relation and argument pair in which the word in question occurs as that argument. We assess the grammaticality syntactically of that particular triple by looking for the probability of seeing that role with that particular head. And then we're also interested in assessing the informativeness of the word by using Clark and Lapata's word informativeness score. This is actually not in the form that you need to have an ILP objective function, but it is easy to rewrite this using a number of auxiliary variables into something that an ILP can handle. Similar to Filipova and Strubo, we have also augmented this objective with a number of constraints that are primarily designed to preserve syntactic well-formedness. We have embellished on Filipova and Struba's list with just a few extra ones that empirically we found to be of greater use, such as how copular constructions are treated, as well as a requirement that transitive verbs actually realize both of their complement arguments. There's, of course, some well-formedness in there to make sure what we get out is really a tree, and then it is important to handle conjunct similarity, especially on the semantic front. Linearization of that special tree, the fourth step, then takes place by linearizing the arguments in the order they appear in a source text sentence, if in fact we got them from the same sentence. Otherwise, we order the arguments according to the marginal probability that the relation in which the first argument appears would appear with an argument that precedes the relation with which the second argument appears. So in other words, we're now summing over all of the arguments that we see those relations with and then looking at the order relative to those two classes. Look, don't blame me, you said PDF only, so there you go, linearization. So what are the results then that you get? Syntactically, I'm pleased to report that sentence enhancement produces better sentences, at least according to log likelihood produced in the Stanford NLP Toolkit's PCFG model of the grammaticality of the sentence. In terms of content, we're measuring this using a new measure that we've coined called Pyramid BE. This is a basic elements measure that is almost exactly like Trotz and Hovey's transformed BE measure, only their normalization procedure assumes that the two sentences you're comparing are of roughly equal length. Here we've adopted a normalization convention that is more similar to what the pyramid scheme itself does, in which you normalize according to the maximum score attainable for the number of dependency triples in the input sentence. So it's a more ambitious normalization, you could say. Using pyramid BE, we've been able to demonstrate that sentence fusion, in fact, really doesn't do that, sentence enhancement really doesn't do that well in comparison to sentence fusion if, in fact, you use the easy method that I described for sentence enhancement. To get the real payoff, you need the hard method. And the hard method is distinguished from the easy method by just how much attention it pays to event co-reference. The problem with event co-reference is that certain verbs have diathetical alternations that give very different treatments to the arguments in question. So again, looking at the criminal trial genre again, we have officers risking 25 years to life. This is a use of the verb risk in which the subject, the officers, bear the risk, versus officers are recklessly endangering the lives of others and thus risk the lives of others, in which the others now bear that same risk. You can't treat these as equals. You wind up associating the wrong arguments with the wrong roles. So we get around this by using distributional similarity between the argument contexts under the assumption that a high argument similarity corresponds to compatible events, compatible diathesis alternations. Now, when we say event co-reference resolution, we mean co-reference resolution that really isn't event co-reference resolution, because of course everyone who works in that field is more interested in alternations such as X kicked Y, implying that Y was injured. We stand no chance whatsoever of detecting this one because they do not both use the verb kick or injure. So this is actually a very limited kind of co-reference resolution that we've implemented, in which we really do need the identical lemma as well as all of this distributional similarity on top of it. And it remains a topic for future work to incorporate real event co-reference resolution. Given an assumption of identical distribution, we align the dependency triples from the two syntactic contexts and solve the argument matching problem as a maximum weight bipartite graph matching problem. And here the weights are coming from a combination of two similarity scores. What we call SIM2 in the paper is actually a cosine similarity among arguments using a 5-word context window of co-occurrence, multiplied by what the paper calls SIM1, which is a related cosine similarity measure over pairs of heads and relations. And there what we're really doing is just adding up all the counts of arguments that we see with those pairs of relations and computing the similarity of the argument vectors themselves. So we project into the arguments. Using that gives us then this improved score. And I'm again happy to report an additional improvement to the syntactic forms acceptability with another improvement to log likelihood. So that's a very nice coincidence that we're getting an improvement both to syntax and to form. So I'd like to acknowledge NSERC, our funding council in Canada, as well as Facebook for the PhD fellowship that Jackie Cheung was supported by as he did this work. And I can take questions now. Thanks very much.
When Jackie was visiting us, I told him that there's a different method to evaluate this, or an extended method to evaluate this, not only using the log likelihood of one parser, but there's an ACL paper from 2007 by Stephen Won, Mark Dras, and other people using 4 parsers. Is there a particular reason why you didn't follow this advice?
You'll have to ask Jackie that. It sounds like a good idea. I guess I'm assuming that Messrs. Won et al. In this 2007 paper showed that using several different parsers gave you more reliable answers than just using one. Yeah, that's a good idea, but Jackie never told me about your suggestion. Probably he knew better that I would actually make him do it. So, yeah, sorry, no, we haven't done that.
We have time for a few more questions.
Very interesting work. I'm kind of surprised, and maybe you were too, by the degradation using enhancement over fusion. Could you, do you think it's really entirely due to these unusual verbs? Or
Yes.
do you think that, why?
Why do I think that? We carefully analyzed the mistakes that we were getting under the initial system without event coreference, and determined from this that we were taking diathesis the wrong way in a number of counterexamples. And then with an additional held-out set, experimented with this event coreference data in which we were able to get a monumental improvement to it. There was also, I think, some suggestion from earlier work, both by Filipova and Struba, and also by Elsner and Santhanam, that this problem of integrating disparate sentences is really very difficult because of all the noise it brings in. And so I guess in retrospect, we probably should have been better prepared for it, just having read the Elsner paper more closely.
Yeah, it seems as though there might be a better way to filter the sentences that you're pulling in from the external texts, to find things that, you know, that there may be a mix of very valuable enhancements and really noisy enhancements. And yeah. I wonder if you've looked at or thought about ways to try to filter that a little bit.
So I think distributional similarity of arguments as gleaned from a dependency parser, together with smarter event coreference than we're doing right now, is probably not such a bad filter. I don't know just how far more we can get without doing the dreaded deeper semantic analysis that we started this program in order to avoid. That's a good question, though.